will now begin the recording. So thanks to all of you who are on here today, and for those of you who just joined, I'm Sue Osthoff with the National Clearinghouse for the Defense of Battered Women. And thanks for being part of today's webinar, which is the fourth in our series of webinars from our new-ish project titled Ending Mass Incarceration, Centralizing Racial Justice, and Developing Alternatives, the Role of Anti-Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault Programs. And before we go any further, I really want to take a moment to thank the Office on Violence Against Women for their support of this webinar and for their support of this very important project. So as you're probably aware, today's webinar is titled, But How Do We Do Racial Justice? So I'm going to move ahead to the next slide. In an effort to save time, I'm going to do the briefest introduction of Kate McCord. You can see from the slide here, Kate is currently the Movement Strategy and Communications Director at the Virginia Sexual and Domestic Violence Action Alliance. That's their dual state coalition. I think I first heard Kate talk about racial justice work that she and others have been doing at her coalition maybe 2.5, 3 years ago. I'm not sure. And I just found myself wanting to learn more and more about what they are doing there in Virginia. And I feel just very fortunate that I've had the opportunity to get to know Kate a bit over the past couple of years, and I just keep learning from her and her coworkers all the time. It's really been a pleasure. So I really hope you'll go back and download the materials or print out the materials that are on the Google Drive, including Kate's bio. Again, if you have any questions, please just type them in the chat box. I'll be collecting them during the presentation, and we'll try to leave 10 or 15 minutes at the end for your questions. And Kate, thanks so much for all the amazing work you've done over the past couple decades and for your willingness to share it with us today. So thank you. I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Oh, great. Thanks, Sue. Well, I wanted to, I'm going to forward this slide here. Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to thank the Clearinghouse and the Office on Violence Against Women for supporting this work. It's really an honor to work with Sue and incredible activists throughout and thought leaders on the work to end mass incarceration and center racial justice in our work. What I'll be talking about today is how we at the Action Alliance, the Dual Coalition, have been trying to do our work from a racial justice lens over about the last 20 years and have formally identified ourselves as an aspiring anti-racist organization for a little more than a decade. I'll be talking today a little bit about our evolution, but mostly about how we work currently and who we are today that are informed by our racial justice lens. I'll also be giving specific examples of how our racial justice lens shows up in our organization and more broadly as a coalition, starting first with examples from our internal policies and practices like hiring and onboarding, personnel policies, staff development, and governance and decision making. And then I'll move on to talking about our outward-facing work like communications and policy, technical assistance training, prevention, and awareness. I'll then spend a little bit of time talking about a few lessons we've learned over the years. And I offer these specific examples of how we do things not because they're necessarily the, quote, right way to integrate a racial justice lens into this work. We are certainly not experts in the work. They're just really examples that may inspire further conversation or thinking about the topic. So Sue showed you my bio. It's downloadable. I don't really need to say much about myself other than I'm still learning. And I've done a variety of aspiring ally work as part of the coalition and in my personal life for probably the past 20 years or so. But beyond the work that I've done, I hold a variety of identities at one time. Like all of you, some of those identities hold privilege and power while others may not. So for example, my ancestors are Scotch-Irish and have been in the country for more generations than actually my family is able to track. And as a white cis woman and mother, raised middle class in the South, I hold privilege. As a queer atheist, anti-racist with a gender nonconforming partner and a blended family, sometimes I'm on the margins. This is the story of most of us, right? Both privilege and marginalization, held in varying degrees, interwoven into who we are and how we interact with the world. That having been said,
Kate,
yeah.
I'm sorry. People are having a hard time hearing you. You sound really loud to me.
Okay.
And just remember that we have somebody who's closed captioning this, so we can't go too fast.
Okay.
Okay.
So slower and louder?
Please.
Okay. All right. So that having been said, this webinar is about our racial justice work. As a white person, the lens through which I see and engage in our racial justice work is through the lens of privilege that I hold, having white skin. And while part of the work of allies or comrades is to hold up the importance of racial justice work and talk about how it might look, this webinar was written through the filter of me, someone who holds white skin privilege, and it's just one perspective of our work. Each person in our coalition will probably see it differently. So where did we start as a coalition working and talking about intersectionality and racism specifically? I just wanted to show you a picture of my friends and colleagues. This is a picture of the Action Alliance staff at a retreat taken 2 months ago. And it's important that I honor my mentors and teachers in racial justice work, many of whom are in this photo, including Kathy Coleman, Angela Blunt, Christy Van Oudenhove, and Ruth Micklem, just to name a few. I've had the privilege of being the one to talk to you today about our story, but really this is the story of all of us in this picture. So where did we start? We weren't this large nor this diverse when we started talking about racial oppression and white supremacy in the coalition. The lion's share of the credit goes, of course, to women of color who were active in the coalition and been talking about and working within interconnecting issues since before the coalition was even founded in 1981. Though it's hard to pinpoint, one early catalyzing event that stands out for me personally in starting conversations about racial inequity was the O.J. Simpson trial of 1994 and the markedly different ways in which African American and white advocates responded to the not guilty verdict that uncovered a gulf that many white anti-domestic violence advocates we hadn't seen before. Were people of color treated fairly in the criminal legal system? Women of color staff and colleagues were willing to take risks with white colleagues and be honest and talk about our perspectives with one another about the trial. Locally in Virginia, we were also noticing disparate levels of the impact of violence. African American women were being killed by their male partners at rates 3 times than that of white women in Virginia. So we started talking about what is the reason for that. 20 years ago, some concluded that the behavior of African American batterers was somehow different from white batterers, or that they had more access to guns, for example. We started looking at other possibilities, that perhaps the high rates of African American women dying wasn't about how individual batterers acted, but instead of how helping systems responded or didn't to early warning signs, and how changing those systems could prevent future deaths. We started looking at systems-level response explanations rather than at individual level of batter behaviors. At the same time, we also started doing our own personal work as a staff in the coalition. The idea was to do internal work before we started asking our member programs working on the front lines to do it themselves as well. We wanted to kind of learn how to walk the walk before we started talking about it. So as a staff in the coalition, we started with having deep discussions, uncovering and sharing our own experiences of racial privilege and racial oppression. We started with taking risks and being vulnerable and telling stories of our lives. We brought in photos of ourselves at the age at which we began to understand the concept of race and what it meant for us and our childhood experiences. We talked about the lessons we'd learned about race and supremacy and privilege. It was painful, and it also helped to build trust. So this was the beginning of finding what we would later acknowledge as two of our primary tenets for dismantling racism and white supremacy and doing this work. First is that relationships are key. They are the foundation in doing this work. And second, that vulnerability strengthens connections and facilitates growth. So speaking of vulnerability, the work of vulnerability researcher Brene Brown, I hope some of you have heard of her, has been really helpful for us when we talk about privilege and oppression with our member programs. Doing racial justice work as an ally requires humility and listening and being vulnerable, especially to the possibility that we as white folks will mess up, will get it wrong, or not do enough. And that's a hard place for many of us to start. So when we train advocates in talking about racial justice, we spend a lot of time on the front end building a container in the training space to help people feel more ready to take risks. We ask advocates and other participants to focus on being from a learning stance rather than a performing stance. Jay Smoot, who's a cultural critic, a DJ, and a blogger for the Ill Doctrine, talks about how racism is a system that, because of its very design, is meant to trip us up as we try to talk about it. In this country, it was, after all, created to legitimize indefensible acts, right, like genocide and enslavement. And it's hard to talk about something that makes no sense. Our culture trains us not to talk about it with one another, to keep us separate and silent. So as a counter to that deep cultural training, we ask ourselves and other advocates to start with compassion for ourselves and the people around us, and to start with vulnerability, if at all possible, because we believe vulnerability is the key to connection and growth. So in practical terms, what does it mean for our internal practices when we say we use a racial justice lens? In general, it means trying to take every decision made at program and governance level and thinking about the potential intended and unintended consequences for people of color. Because racial justice is part of our mission, principles, and decision-making process, we try to keep it at the forefront of everything that we do. Some of how we do our work reflects our commitment to social justice in general, and it's hard to parse out elements that are specifically racial justice. But knowing that specifics are helpful, I'll try to be as specific as possible about how we do our work from a racial justice lens. For example, how does adding a racial justice lens change how we write a job announcement? Or what does racial justice look like when applied to personnel leave policies? So in this next section, I'll be talking about how we write our job ads, interview candidates, mentoring and onboarding, personnel policies, budget processes, staff development, etc. So this is an example of one of our recent job ads this year. For more than 20 years, we've included the following clause in all of our job ads that said, quote, "Those discriminated against in the traditional workplace are encouraged to apply." Now our ads are more specific to call people in. They say people of color, women, LGBTQ candidates, and people of diverse backgrounds are strongly encouraged to apply. We're committed to a diverse workplace and to supporting our staff with ongoing career development opportunities. So we want to call folks into our work and to let candidates know that we don't just believe diversity is the right thing to do, but it actually makes our work stronger and more relevant. In terms of job qualifications, none of our positions have ever had any formal education requirement because we don't believe initials after our last name necessarily carries more expertise than lived experiences or work experience. In terms of interview questions, 5 years ago, we added 4 non-scored questions to every candidate interview, even for internships, that help us assess the openness and readiness for job applicants to think or talk about racial justice. So we explain to applicants that we do our work from a racial justice lens, and that racial justice work, if you're part of the staff, is not something that's optional. So the questions that we ask, for example, are what strengths do you think you'd be able to contribute to the Action Alliance's work toward becoming an anti-racist organization? What do you think would be the most challenging about engaging in anti-racism work? How do you think sexual violence and intimate partner violence are linked to other forms of oppression? These are hard questions for people to answer in an interview. Most people who come in for interviews aren't expecting that we're going to ask them about how they would contribute to dismantling racism when they're applying to be a data specialist, for example, or a development intern. But we're not looking really for a polished answer. We're just looking for openness and readiness to think critically about how anti-violence work connects to anti-racism work. In terms of our onboarding, we've had a mentoring process where our seasoned staff have been paired with new staff to meet and have one-on-one conversations for the first 6 months of their hire about our racial justice work and how it looks in our Action Alliance culture. Last year we had a large influx of new hotline staff in the summer, which honestly overwhelmed our mentoring capacity for a bit, so we're going back to the drawing board about how to make that work when large groups of people enter staff. For our personnel policies, we welcome babies and children and fur babies and fur children to the office because we believe family is defined by individuals and that our bonds and work are made stronger when we feel free to bring our whole selves to the office. That cute little baby in the lower right-hand corner is my youngest, Arlo, who came to work with me every day for the first 9 months of his life, and he's 13 now. Our staff holidays aren't determined by a Christian calendar. Many people on staff don't identify as Christian, so staff can choose their own floating holidays that are personally significant to them. In addition, we offer what we call Circle of Life leave that staff can take for whatever they like, whether it's taking care of a sick pet or attending their kids' choir concert or just a mental health day when it's gorgeous outside. Also along personnel policies, we're committed to paying living wages for all staff, which includes a commitment to pay 100% health insurance premiums for full-time staff and contributions to retirement accounts. We offer paid internships because we know the ability to offer unpaid labor is only an option for folks with a high degree of economic security and is not an option for everyone. We also don't run criminal background checks on our prospective employees because we believe institutionalized racist practices mean that people of color and virtually anyone who experiences chronic economic insecurity are more likely to be arrested and convicted, and we don't believe necessarily the absence or presence of a criminal record necessarily affects your ability to do your job. Administratively, staff has input in the budgeting process. So one of the many ways that power is measured and exercised is by access to and prioritization of funds. In many offices, a select few, usually mostly white folks, generate the budget every year. To counter traditional dominant white culture habits, we do our best to practice transparency and democracy with the budgeting process by soliciting staff input every year as the next year's budget is being developed, with specific questions around, do you think we should reprioritize funds in any way next year? We then present the adopted budget at a staff meeting every year to gather and respond to questions. In terms of supervision, we are now looking at how to exercise power in a more shared way versus hierarchically. So this year we're piloting a group supervision model among the leadership team just to experiment and see if it works, and then we'll expand with the rest of the staff. We've also instituted annual staff evaluations for everyone that are self-written and then shared with a supervisor. These are all examples of how we try to practice shared power internally. In terms of governance and decision making, because we believe representation of people of color at decision-making tables is really essential to doing good work, our bylaws call for our governing body to be at least 1/3 people of color, a third survivors, and a third representatives of advocacy organizations. Racial justice is now explicitly part of our consensus process in our governing body decisions. Last year, we adopted a new consensus process on the governing body, which centers decisions on whether or not they will increase racial justice. So you're looking now at the new consensus process steps, which our governing body or our board of directors, some might call them. They follow these questions. So discussion step A is, what is a positive or exciting aspect about this proposal? Will this proposal advance racial equity and inclusion? What will this proposal accomplish? And then discussion step B, we look at negatives, and then we assess, is at least 75% of the group in support of the proposal, and does that group include those who have been historically marginalized at all, and or in society, in our organization or in society? The process has actually worked really well. We're happy to share it with you, and we've included this handout in the downloadable materials for this webinar. So the first time we used the new consensus process that I just talked about in the last slide, the governing body consented on signing on to the policy platform for the Vision for Black Lives, which, if you haven't seen it, is a bold platform with an audacious vision for things like reparations, equity, and healing. We were pretty excited about that. In terms of staff development, in the past we've incorporated discussions around individual and systemic privilege and oppression into our staff meetings. And we consider those topics as essential to our continuing development as learning about new interventions or prevention strategy. For example, we held a staff viewing of Ava DuVernay's documentary 13th about the evolution of slavery last fall, shortly after the movie was released on Netflix. This year, we're divvying up the task of planning our staff meetings to rotating teams of staff all year. We're asking each team to incorporate a social or racial justice element of their choosing into each staff meeting so we can continue to flex our muscles around continually making connections to our work and thinking big and having all of our staff participate in that process. So if you're wondering about the makeup of our staff, currently, if I'm counting right, our staff, we have 19 full-time people on staff, 8 of whom are people of color, 2 of whom are immigrants. There are 8 folks on our staff leadership team, 3 of whom are people of color. And we always strive for greater staff diversity because we think our work is made stronger by a variety of voices and lived experiences. But the measure of whether or not we're being real about our racial justice work goes beyond the number of people of color on staff. In some ways, our racial justice lens has become so integrated into how we do things it's become invisible to many members of our staff and is really unknown to our new staff. So a few years ago, we decided to map out our racial justice work along a 10-year timeline from 2004 to 2014 to be able to describe the specific examples of how we try to pay attention to and counteract racial oppression and white supremacy in our work. It really was a helpful tool in sparking discussions about where we've been and also how far we still have to go. So the timeline is also included in your materials today as an example of how to map your own racial justice efforts. I hope you find it helpful. So sometimes what strengthens our racial justice work has actually nothing to do with talking about or thinking about race or racism. To break white dominant culture habits, we build spaciousness into our team meetings for connecting and building relationships, usually through check-ins before the meeting business agenda starts. So this is where we talk about what's going on in our lives besides work, like updates with our kids or aging parents, or plans for recreation or fun, or how our pets are doing, or sometimes venting or seeking support for grief or other hard things that we all go through from time to time. Last week, our member services team opened their meeting with a word association game to acknowledge how much we love and admire one of our staff members who's been undergoing chemo and radiation treatments. Being the center of attention, it was not a sought-after experience for this particular person. She doesn't love being the center of attention, but it was an opportunity for her to experience directly the kind of love and support that exists for her among her colleagues, which we believe is also a source of healing. So we've also institutionalized fun and joy. Every year, about 3 to 4 staff volunteer for 1 year to act as what we call Action Alliance Wellness Fairies. Their mission is to bring joy and fun and connection to the staff. Our Wellness Fairies really help us build community, many times through food and fun. They've arranged a bubble wrap dance party where we just broke all the bubbles on the bubble wrap in a large room dancing to crazy disco music. We've had a Rice Krispie treat bake-off. We've had a high tea complete with fancy hat making party. We've had watermelon seed spitting contests in the summer and field trips and all kinds of ridiculous fun. We now have a ping pong table in our new office, so I'm hoping we'll see a ping pong tournament crop up soon. So the Wellness Fairies aren't really considered explicitly part of our racial justice work, but what they do is essential to doing our racial justice work well, because they help build relationships and community, which helps build trust. And relationships, community, and trust are 3 essential foundations for doing effective racial justice work. Besides joy, another part of the work is about embracing grief. So last summer, after the murders of Philando Castile and Alton Sterling, who you may recall are 2 black men who were killed by police officers in separate incidents, the grief in the office the morning after was palpable. We were scheduled to run a run-through of a workshop with our whole staff. Instead of doing that, we ditched the plan for work that morning and created a space for folks to just be in community with one another. We set out essential oils and pencils and art supplies and paper, and held 2 hours of just open space for folks to talk or not talk or walk around and experience compassion and empathy. It was a really powerful moment for our staff to be able to take that time and feel supported in doing so. On those kinds of hard days, we rediscover that doing racial justice work isn't always about what we do necessarily, but who we are with one another. So those are some examples of our internal practices. I'm going to next talk a little bit about what our outward-facing racial justice work looks like. This image is a beautiful image, and I think it conveys what we aspire to be, which is bold and courageous and non-compromising. Some days I think we are this. I believe we are this. But some days I think we still have a ways to go. So in this next section, I'll be showing examples of how our racial justice lens shows up in communications and training and policy and public awareness and prevention. Much of our outward-facing racial justice work for the past 15 years or so has focused on trying to make the case for our local sexual and domestic violence agencies that the work of dismantling racism is actually part of their work. So I'll talk a little bit about that. In our communications work, we're constantly trying to tie in the narrative about how racial justice connects with sexual violence and intimate partner violence work. So when we do that, naming racism and justice are key. When the issue is about race, we try to say this is about race and be explicit in that. The ways in which racism and privilege operate on systemic levels is really difficult for us with privilege to see sometimes. So we have to be explicit in talking about it and making the connections clear for folks. For example, we made this Facebook post shortly after the executive order commonly referred to as the Muslim ban took effect. That was in January. We could have just posted the article that the title was 5 Things You Can Do Right Now to Fight the Muslim Ban, but instead we added context that links our values of offering refuge and sanctuary to people fleeing violence in their homes to the value of offering refuge and sanctuary to people who are fleeing violence in their home countries. Another example, when the video of Sandra Bland's traffic stop in Texas was released a couple summers ago, we posted the video and explicitly named race and connected with our work by saying, this is a quote from the post, "As you watch the video, please consider how this trooper's behavior may impact people of color who are survivors of trauma and violence, who are thinking about calling law enforcement for help." It was a simple statement, but it seemed to resonate because it was one of the posts that had the largest Facebook reach for the whole year among our members. Last year, we established an internship for journalism students that we call The Real Story. It's a journalism project that analyzes and rewrites news stories to reflect a trauma-informed, survivor-centered, and racial justice lens. The Real Story internship has offered us another avenue to be able to tell stories of expressions of systemic racism from the perspective of communities that are actually affected. So we are centering the narratives of those who are being directly affected. So for example, when we wrote about the spike in reported hate crimes after the presidential election, we included quotes from people who were directly affected. When we wrote about Standing Rock, we quoted the water protectors themselves, rather than quoting observers who have been deemed experts by institutions with power. If you want a link to our blog, I think Dot might be able to bring it up and put it in the chat box for you. Other ways that we make connections through our blog, we operate at the Action Alliance through what we call 3 interconnected lenses, which are racial justice, trauma-informed, and asset-building lenses. So this is one example of how we talk about those 3 lenses and how they interconnect. So we believe that our culture continues to promote and perpetuate racism, which then impacts access to equality and safety and justice and resources. So therefore, part of our work is about promoting racial justice. We believe that individuals and communities have both internal and external assets that promote health, joy, and connection, and we try to support the assets that already exist. We believe that those who have been victimized need power, control, and agency in their lives in order to heal, so we work from a trauma-informed lens. Virginia has the dubious distinction of sending more of our kids into the criminal legal system than any other state in the nation. So this year we started a blog series on the school-to-prison pipeline to be explicit in talking about how in Virginia, Black and brown kids are being treated differently and punished more harshly than their white counterparts for being disruptive in school. The vast majority of these kids are trauma survivors, and it was important for us to make the connection clear between our movement's work and caring about the school-to-prison pipeline. We actually think it's a more accurate term to call it the trauma-to-prison pipeline, so we've been reframing it that way in Virginia. Our Trauma-to-Prison Pipeline blog series has featured articles that make connections between trauma, racism, and the criminalization of Black and brown suffering. We've also featured stories about really incredible community-based organizing efforts that center the experiences of currently and formerly incarcerated youth, like Rise for Youth based in Richmond, Virginia. We see our work to dismantle the trauma-to-prison pipeline as a perfect nexus of a prevention work plus our 3 lenses. So building trauma-informed responses in schools reduces the over-criminalization of youth of color, which in turn builds individual and community assets. We're currently trying to simplify and strengthen our messages that help link trauma, racism, justice, and safety. So I wanted to show you an example of how we've messaged those links on the trauma to prison pipeline. So this is what the slide says, if you can't see it very well. The trauma to prison pipeline fails young people who are experiencing high levels of toxic stress by responding in overly punitive ways to youth who exhibit normal reactions to trauma and toxic stress. Youth of color and youth with disabilities are particularly targeted for disproportionately high levels of heavy-handed disciplinary responses to vague and subjective infractions in school, such as defiance of authority or classroom disruption. Viewed from a trauma-informed lens, these same behaviors may signal youth who are suffering and struggling with ongoing effects of trauma. The Action Alliance believes that everyone deserves racially equitable responses that are compassionate and trauma-informed and which build individual and community assets. And we found that blogging is a great way for us to practice messaging and making the connections for folks. We get to refine things more and more the more we write about it. We also try to spark conversations locally. This is kind of a new process for us. If you haven't heard of Brescia Meadows, she's an Ohio teenager who was 14 years old last summer the night she shot and killed her father in what her mother describes as an act of heroism to save the family from his ongoing violence and threats of murder. She had sought help repeatedly from police and other so-called helping institutions, but to no avail. So she's been incarcerated since July 2016, spending her 15th birthday behind bars. The Action Alliance, in partnership with Virginia Commonwealth University Wellness Resource Center and the Office for Multicultural Student Affairs, also with the university, hosted a free Brescia teach-in last month to discuss the criminalization of youth of color, the trauma to prison pipeline, and the work being done locally to reduce the incarceration of suffering and traumatized youth. So this is one of the ways in which we're working to build a bigger we, connecting with one another based on shared visions and values, namely that trauma survivors should be seen and believed rather than failed by the system, and also that kids should be free. In terms of training, we have operated a training institute for a number of years that's aimed at providing forward-thinking training to victim advocates and others doing frontline work to address and prevent sexual and intimate partner violence. How we talk about and train on the connections between anti-violence work and anti-racism work has changed a lot over the past 15 years. So I'd like to talk a little bit about that evolution and what we learned. For years, we paid consultants to come in and lead a lot of our anti-oppression and anti-racism trainings on our behalf. We were a little scared to put ourselves out there as, quote, leaders in anti-racism and racial justice work by standing in front of the classroom. It was probably 10 years between when we first started our internal racism and white privilege dialogues as staff and when we finally wrote, with the help of one of our wonderful allies, Kathy Woodson from Virginia Organizing, and launched our own training curriculum on dismantling racism. And once we did that, we learned a lot about how not to do things. So our early dismantling racism trainings were built on the premise that you needed to start by working on yourself first before you can, quote, do the work. So we asked our participants who were white to think about or work on our internalized white supremacy, and we asked people of color who are participants to do the same with internalized oppression. We learned from experience that that was not an effective or helpful starting point for training participants. They were often strangers walking into a room and being asked to make themselves that vulnerable that early and to tap into really extremely painful emotions like guilt and shame and anger. That was just really hard on everyone. And when things get hard, all kinds of distracting techniques come up in a training to help participants avoid talking about the things that we want them to talk about. So people would start challenging the trainers or each other or get defensive or avoidant or resistant. And we needed people to be able to stay engaged long enough that they became curious rather than defensive. So we kept working at it and experimenting. And about 3 years ago, we tried this. We created 2 new frames, which actually seemed to work pretty well. They worked a lot better than what we were doing, and we still use these. The frames are this. First of all, that racism is traumatic. Living as a person of color in this country is a traumatic experience. Getting up every day is an act of strength and resilience. So we talk about chronic trauma and how it's a force that overwhelms our normal coping mechanisms and can make us feel helpless. We talk about the effects of toxic stress on long-term health outcomes. We ask people to talk about ACEs or adverse childhood experiences and consider whether being a chronic target of racism could be a kind of adverse childhood experience, because it's not technically part of ACEs, but we believe it is part of an adverse childhood experience, being the target of racism, and how that experience is actually lifelong. Second, we talk about how racial privilege and oppression really do in many ways shape survivor access to health and safety, and that good advocacy is not colorblind, because the world is not blind to skin color. We talk about how the world is actually not a level playing field, and that it's an advocate's job to understand the landscape when working on an individual level, and to help trauma survivors understand that the basics like safety and trustworthiness and accountability and communication look different depending on how much privilege they hold and how oppression is shaping their lives. We talk about how, though we may have been taught it's a good thing to say that I treat everyone the same, it actually means that you can't be a good advocate when you can't see variations in how people get justice and safety and help, depending on how much privilege survivors hold. We consider a racial justice lens as an essential element to providing trauma-informed advocacy. So that's how we started talking about it. And when we framed it that way, it's part of being a good advocate and not just an add-on, we actually started getting traction. It made a lot more sense to frontline advocates. It made a lot more sense to all of us. So for both frames, when we're talking about it, we start by explaining and showing specific examples of systemic racism and privilege and how they operate and affect people of color and white people differently. We use charts and graphs. We lay out in chart form how major systems in our country, like educational systems, a criminal legal system, banking, media, treat people of color differently from white people. Because systemic or institutionalized racism is designed to be amorphous, for many white folks this is a process of making the invisible visible. Sometimes it's overwhelming for people who haven't had the chance to learn about systemic advantages and disadvantages that exist in all of the major institutions that operate in this country, and that can open up white guilt and a lot of grief from all the participants. And we've seen that when that comes up in trainings, often white folks in the room will look to people of color in the room to take care of our feelings, which people of color often generously do in the trainings. But because it's not fair to ask people of color to expend emotional labor making us feel better about institutionalized racism, we've started breaking into racial groups at that point so white folks can support and hold each other accountable rather than asking people of color to do that. So this is a handout that's also available in your materials that we use in our trainings to talk about how the interlocking systems relate. We talk about how patriarchy and racism are connected. Many of us who've been working to address and prevent IPV and sexual violence are as symptoms of a larger systemic problem, for example, patriarchy, or a culture that systems that support and value traditional notions of masculine over traditional notions of feminine. Another way to look at the interconnectedness or intersections is this. So violence is an expression of and a tool to maintain oppression. For example, take racism and white supremacy. First of all, violence supports racism. Sexual violence has been used historically as a tool for colonization or a tool to maintain white supremacy. Second, racism supports violence. People of color may be less likely to seek help for fear of unjust treatment or deportation, etc. Layers of oppression make some people more vulnerable to violence, and all oppressions are perpetrated by a power over dynamic rather than a shared power. These systems of interlocking power and oppression are often clear to people of color and often invisible to folks who have white skin privilege. Beyond talking about how systems of oppression interlock, we also talk more specifically about tools of oppression on individual levels and on collective levels. Advocates understand that victim blaming is a common narrative, and if they can apply it to victim blaming that happens on an individual level, they can also apply it to groups of people. So let me give you an example. We'll talk about how victim blaming is a weapon of sexism. We ask folks, how is victim blaming used to shame and demoralize survivors of sexual violence? How does victim blaming affect the way survivors interpret trauma and violation that happens to them? How do survivors internalize victim blaming attitudes? How is victim blaming used to deflect responsibility away from perpetrators of violence? How does victim blaming affect the survivor's ability to access safety and justice? So we ask folks to walk that through the individual level. And then we ask the training participants to insert the word person of color or immigrant into the same exercise and talk about victim blaming as a weapon of racism rather than a weapon of sexism. So for example, how is victim blaming used to shame and demoralize people of color and or immigrants? How does victim blaming affect the way people of color and or immigrants interpret the trauma and violation that happened to them? How is victim blaming used to deflect responsibility away from perpetrators of violence? How does victim blaming affect the ability of people of color or immigrants to access safety and justice? So I hope that gives you an idea of how this exercise works. We walk through the rest of the tactics in a similar way around minimization and denial, using children, using economic abuse, psychological abuse, etc. And in those ways, advocates are able to make the parallels more clearly between individual tactics of oppression and collective tactics of oppression. Connecting the pieces also entails calling out what is happening right now that affects survivors' ability to access safety and justice. We believe we have a responsibility to point out and counter racist cultural narratives disguised as policy directives, for example, such as build the wall. The examples of this handout were brainstormed by members of our Racial Justice Task Force during an activity we did last fall. We asked our task force members to identify what we call outer layer factors. So some of you who are familiar with the social ecological model understand outer layer factors are community practices, societal factors, and what's happening currently in the world and current events. So we asked the Racial Justice Task Force to look at some examples of those factors that might impact how or whether survivors of color can access help and safety. So this handout, which is also available in your materials, talks about the impact of current rhetoric around build the wall, or the impact around racist cultural narratives, or the impact around the trauma to prison pipeline. In terms of our technical assistance, last year we released 2 best practices manuals for Virginia's college campuses about addressing gender-based violence. And we grounded the manuals in the 3 interlocking lenses that we use, that I mentioned earlier, which are racial justice, trauma-informed, and asset-building lenses. The Campus Best Practices manuals offer recommendations for developing policies and practices that use those 3 lenses to address systemic oppression and build racial justice, to build a better response on Virginia's college campuses to gender-based violence. The guide is available for download at our Community Solutions Resource Clearinghouse. So I think Sue or Dot might be able to post that link in the chat box. Of course, diversity of images is important when we're showing models in our public awareness or prevention campaigns, but we try to go beyond the appearance of diversity and actually consult with communities of color and ask them directly about our awareness campaigns and prevention strategies. So for example, when we developed this series of posters for the Red Flag campaign, which is our nationwide bystander intervention strategy for college campuses, we consulted with and held multiple focus groups with students and staff from several of Virginia's historically black colleges and universities to ensure the images and messaging reflected on the posters actually reflected their lived experiences. I think the URL is also available in the chat box if you wanted to see those posters. In terms of our prevention work, we created the prevention strategy that we call Do You, Building Youth Resilience Through Creative Expression, as a primary prevention strategy that seeks to help youth build resilience using creative expression for ages 13 to 17. So the goals of the strategy are around building compassion and empathy, learning to model fairness and equality, learning about healthy sexuality, mastering communication skills, and adapting media literacy tools to analyze media messages to be critical consumers. The content of Do You also includes having teens think about privilege and oppression and marginalization in terms that they can understand. And because we seek to conduct our work through a racial justice lens, as we developed this program, we tested it specifically with African American youth, because the last thing we want to do is create a program that isn't culturally relevant to a community that is disproportionately experiencing the most lethal violence in Virginia. Our new poster series, Advocacy was designed specifically in response to marginalized communities telling us that a significant barrier to getting help from sexual and domestic violence agencies is mistrust of the system and not knowing what advocacy means. So the Advocacy project's goal is to describe the tenets of advocacy and features direct quotes from survivors who have accessed the services of Virginia's sexual and domestic violence agencies. We haven't yet released these posters publicly, and we're currently planning a follow-up focus group with members of marginalized communities who identify as women, including Latinas, African American women, and immigrant women, to ask for feedback that will help us evaluate the effectiveness of the final poster designs. We also try to pay attention to where communities are not getting served. For example, we collaborate with the Virginia Anti-Violence Project to operate a statewide LGBTQ sexual assault and partner abuse helpline. When we developed a poster series to advertise the service, we ran focus groups in the community to make sure our messaging and models reflected the community accurately. Because trans women of color are at extremely high risk for being targets of violence, yet also encounter a multitude of barriers when seeking help, we specifically chose to represent trans women of color in the poster series and checked in on the images through focus groups. In Virginia, as I mentioned before, African American and black women are victims of family and intimate partner violence, homicide, at much higher rates than white women. And this is, we believe, the result of disparities in access to community resources, justice, and safety. And the disparities in access are a result of racism. So our I Deserve campaign focuses on flipping a prevailing cultural narrative that blames women for their own victimization, and instead lifts up young women who are black or African American as worthy of respect, protection, and safety. And you can probably see the link for that campaign in your chat box. All of that having been said, we have to be careful when we focus all of our efforts on building the resilience of communities of color or offering them new and better ways to find a hotline number, right? Resilience and access to resources are important, but focusing on changing the individuals who are being oppressed or marginalized doesn't make them any less oppressed or marginalized. So we also need to address systemic barriers based on race. I love this quote from Thich Nhat Hanh. When you plant lettuce, if it doesn't grow well, you don't blame the lettuce. You look for reasons it's not doing well. It may need fertilizer or more water or less sun. You never blame the lettuce. So looking at systemic responses. Our policy work, specifically legislative advocacy, has actually long been grounded in an anti-racist framework. For example, as far back as 1998, about 20 years ago, we adopted a position against the death penalty and explicitly named race as one of the reasons why we opposed it. So this slide is our statement against it that says, recognizing that the death penalty is disproportionately and unjustly applied to people of color and people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds and people with serious mental health issues, it is not consistent with our mission to support the death penalty. Likewise, our 1997 opposition to criminal background checks as a prerequisite for accessing shelter or any other services reads like this. Policies that limit access to services based on criminal history are inherently racist and result in a greater proportion of women of color being blocked from accessing shelter or other services. Such policies are not consistent with the Action Alliance's belief that all people have the right to a life free of violence or our efforts to address oppression. So looking at our policy practices now. So we've long opposed enhanced penalties for the unequal ways in which those penalties are levied against communities of color. For example, almost every year it seems like at least one legislator reaches out to us to ask us to support a bill for enhanced penalties for committing family violence in the presence of a child, for example. And we're always in the position of explaining to the legislator that we believe that there are other more effective ways to protect a child than putting one of their parents or step-parents in jail or prison for longer sentences. And we've been thinking lately about what does it mean to use our political capital in service of our racial justice work. So this year we made a significant pivot in our policy work by revamping our policy strategic plan to in part center our racial justice work so that it now includes explaining and working at the intersections of reproductive justice, racial justice, and violence prevention work, as well as efforts to starve the trauma to prison pipeline in Virginia. For example, one bill we pushed hard on this year in conjunction with several other partners like the ACLU and Legal Aid Justice Center was a bill that would prevent students in pre-K through third grade from being suspended for longer than 5 days. Anybody who knows kids understands that when you're that age you don't even understand why you're being suspended. But unfortunately this bill failed. We still have more work to do. I hope some of you had a chance to hear the webinar a couple weeks ago from Kelly and Jen from the Idaho Coalition about centering their work on historically marginalized communities. While much of our work has been focused on internal practices and making connections with sexual and domestic violence victim advocates between their work and racial justice work, the Idaho Coalition has done really inspiring work connecting with other groups who center and or led by members of marginalized communities. As a coalition, this is pretty new territory for us, so I'll talk about where we've been starting with baby steps. If you want to hear about really incredible work building those kinds of coalitions, please learn more about what Idaho is doing. They're one of our shining stars for us. So back to us. Last year, in response to larger conversations that we've been having as part of Move to End Violence, we started reaching out beyond our familiar circle to a few other groups who center communities of color in racial justice work. Our initial contacts with them had really just been about us showing up for them as allies, whether it's part of a direct action at the street level, amplifying their message, or adopting their legislative bills as our priorities. This photo was taken last fall at what was called a Justice Parade for Incarcerated Youth, essentially a big march to protest Virginia's school-to-prison pipeline. It was organized by Performing Statistics, Art 180, Rise for Youth, and Legal Aid Justice Center, which are all working together to connect incarcerated teens and artists and Virginia's top legal experts to transform the juvenile justice system. We actually ended up shutting down a main street in the middle of Richmond, Virginia during rush hour on a Friday with a huge crowd, drumming, and banners that featured the work and voices of incarcerated teens, all with great media coverage and a police escort. So one of the things that I learned from the organizers is if you want cooperation from the city, don't call your march a protest or a march. You call it a justice parade, and then you get help from law enforcement. I thought it was brilliant. You can find out more about Performing Statistics in the link that I think Dot is probably putting in the chat box. So we're continuing to build relationships that center the voices of incarcerated youth and showing up when they need us. This is a picture taken at Virginia's General Assembly building this year as legislators were holding committee hearings about bills to shut down the school-to-prison pipeline. So we're trying to come to their table to offer help, not building our own table and inviting them to it. And as I said before, this is really new territory for us, but we're really trying to find people with whom we have chemistry, starting connections, and asking about what do you need and how can we help. So what we've learned over the years. We've learned that the work is always evolving, and I think that's probably pretty obvious to most of us on this call, that racial justice work is not easy work. It's been really messy and nonlinear and sometimes painful, honestly, but it's always changing in both slow and fast ways. We know it's a continual, lifelong process that will never be finished, and we start every day knowing that new work has to be done in new ways and that there's actually value in the struggle. And we've also learned that we are not experts, that we don't have a magic formula other than staying at the table and understanding that mistakes are also learning opportunities. We know that our racial justice work will likely look different from yours, and that's a good thing because we want to learn from one another about how to do this. We've also learned that it's really helpful to be clear about messaging. It took us about 10 years, it seems, I think that might actually be true, of actively working to get racial justice into our mission statement for the coalition. There are potentially many reasons that it took this long, but honestly I think one of the reasons for that, for the length of it, was because we failed to make the connection clear between sexual violence and intimate partner violence work and racial justice. When we framed it as the right thing to do, that dismantling racism is the right thing to do, our members thought of it as add-on to their work, and it's hard for folks who are doing crisis work to do more work if they think it's an add-on. So since we've reframed to the concept that racial justice is actually an essential part of trauma-informed advocacy, and you can't do good advocacy as a colorblind advocate, there's been a lot more traction and buy-in and understanding from folks. For allies, this is one of our continuing lessons, is to listen to people of color who tell us where they need us to put our efforts. So white supremacy is connected to white privilege. And when racist systems tell us over and over again that our ideas as white folks and our values and even our very lives carry more worth than people of color, that's white supremacy. As Alicia Garza, one of the co-founders of Black Lives Matter, says, we need you defecting from white supremacy and changing the narrative by breaking white silence. Another thing we're continually learning as allies in the work is embracing discomfort and to know that we're not going to get it right all the time and that we're going to mess up. So one example is a story that happened a few years ago when we were working on developing our questions for the interviewing job applicants, the ones that I mentioned earlier in this webinar. The staff of the Women of Color Caucus met and proposed a list of questions to our entire staff for what we should ask new candidates, and then presented it to the entire staff. And the white folks on the staff, including me, began kind of wordsmithing it. And after a while, one of my dear colleagues, who's a woman of color, said, "What is it about white folks that makes you need to put it in your own words in order to feel invested in it?" And it was a moment of really deep discomfort and feeling guilty and exposed and just wrong and bad. But it was also something to reflect on and to learn from. So know that we will mess up. And, you know, for many of our white allies, it feels like there's a competition to be the most evolved, the most non-racist person on the planet. But that's not real. If you're white and raised in this culture as I have been, we will all mess up. So to give you an example that happened just last week, one of the slides that I submitted to the Clearinghouse for this very webinar that you're looking at that has since been removed shows a close-up of a sign at a protest that said, "We're all immigrants." I've used this slide in several PowerPoints before. But Dot at the Clearinghouse wondered if it was an appropriate image and correctly made the point that we're actually not all immigrants. Some of us are indigenous to this nation. Some of us were stolen and brought here in chains. So Dot was right, and it was like, oh, duh, that's so right. Thanks for noticing. I mean, I'll find something else. It's okay. We just need to learn from it and keep trying without a whole lot of crazy defensiveness. So when judgment comes up, try turning to curiosity. Instead of saying, that was so stupid and ineffective, to start to think about, I wonder why I did that. Instead of thinking, I'm a bad white ally for having those thoughts, think about, I wonder where my discomfort is coming from and what can I learn from it. Again, going back to Jay Smooth, remember that racism makes no sense and was designed to separate us and disconnect us from one another. It was designed to, we're meant to not talk about it. We're meant to avoid walking through the discomfort, and learning from it only serves systems of oppression. Avoiding it only serves systems of oppression. So engaging in radical connection and honesty and transparency actually undermines oppression. As potential allies, we have to stay at the table and not make our discomfort the center of what's going on. To expect comfort is privilege operating. To expect everyone in the room to take care of me and my discomfort is my privilege operating. Also expect pushback at many turns. And try not to hide from it. We've tried lots of ways over the years to have conversations with our membership with varying degrees of success. Quite a few years ago, a membership group of aspiring white allies worked together for a year to draft what we call the Statement of Commitment from white allies to do this work as a coalition. We ran several drafts by the Women of Color Caucus to get their approval before we released it. And when we finally released it to our membership, it went over, honestly, it went over like a lead balloon. Looking back, we realized we had a lot more work to do on the front end in making the case to make clear the connections between racial justice and this movement and why advocates should care about dismantling racism. So we thought, because we've been talking about dismantling racism in so many venues over the years, that the case had been made, but it hadn't. So sometimes pushback is informative and will help you determine if there's other work you need to do, go back and do over. Try to stay focused on the big picture. I know this has been a challenge for us over the years. The movement is so much bigger than one action. So working for racial justice can start anywhere, at home, at work, with our children and families, in the streets. Jay Smooth, again, uses a dental hygiene metaphor that racism and privilege aren't like cavities, they're like plaque. You don't just get them removed and move on. It requires ongoing maintenance, like brushing your teeth every day. Working from a racial justice lens means thinking in terms of the long haul and having to show up every day for it. If you haven't seen his TEDx talk, I encourage you to look it up because it's really fantastic, and it's a great training tool. So finally, it's also about not just changing what we do, but actually who we are. It's about bringing people in rather than putting them down. It's about focusing on strengths and assets and community and connection. It's about nurturing the collective rather than holding up traditional leadership or heroes. And it's about doing the work fueled by fierce, radical love and courage, which is something that we can also learn from Black Lives Matter. The love and the courage that is a source of that movement. That's what this moment calls for and really has always called for. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Kate. Wow, what a powerful presentation. We did have some questions, but before I get to the questions, I just want to say that you can actually copy out that chat because there's tons of links in that chat that you may want to have. And as Dot has said in the chat, that we'll send out links to Google Drive, the Google Drive where all those wonderful handouts that Kate referenced and that Dot kept putting up the links to will also be available. So there's multiple ways that you can get those materials. If you still have trouble, you can email Dot at ncdbw.org. And we'll make sure you get the materials because I know sometimes people have some troubles on Google Drive. I also really want to thank Kate for sending Dot in advance of this webinar. All of those links made Dot's job a little bit easier than sometimes it is during some of these webinars. And Dot, thank you for posting everything. So let me just get to some of the questions here, Kate. One of them came early, and it was when you were talking about not doing criminal background checks. And Zoe asked, does Virginia not have regulations about running background checks related to working with children?
I don't know if I can answer that question about whether Virginia has regulations or not. But as a coalition, the only direct service work we do is through our statewide hotline. So we are not a shelter, so we don't offer direct services. So it's something I can look up and get back to you about that if you're in Virginia.
Zoe, maybe you can say where you are, but that may be an issue for other people about whether or not like doing a hotline is considered direct service or not. So it's sort of interesting. And Jan asked, does your governing body consist of both member program representatives and community members?
Yes, it has. It is primarily member services programs, folks. It has been both.
I'm sorry, could you say that again, please?
It has been both.
Okay.
Yeah.
And how big is it now?
It's fewer than 20 people. I'm not sure of the exact number.
And how many member programs are there in Virginia?
About 60.
Wow, okay. Judy asked, when you were talking about the real story, and I also missed it too, is there like a storytelling resource called Real Story, or is that the name of your blog?
That's the name of our internship that we started. So the original concept behind it was to look at news stories, for example, that say really problematic things like there was a homicide, there was an intimate partner homicide last night. The children were in the house and they were unharmed. So to look at news stories and to rewrite them from a trauma-informed, survivor-centered, and racial justice lens. For example, children who witness a homicide may be physically uninjured, but they are certainly not unharmed. But we expanded it when we started this past year, when we started looking at the kinds of coverage that were happening about current events. So around the hate crime Spike and around the coverage of of Standing Rock, and trying to make sure that the voices of people who are actually directly affected and on the ground and aren't just folks that you might see as talking heads, that their voices were represented in the stories about those particular events.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Matthew had a question about your approach to blog writing. And he asked, how do you not let fear of getting something wrong stop you from actually getting things out? I guess he wants to know about not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. And I'm also curious if you could talk a little bit about who actually are the writers of the blogs.
So, yeah, I totally hear you about the fear being a strangulating force. I think that we have certainly had that happen, and we're just trying to be consciously more brave and take more risks and know that it's the right thing to do. But I completely understand that there are things that we are scared to do ourselves. In terms of who's writing the blog, the entire Trauma to Prison Pipeline series was actually written by one of our interns and then edited by staff. So she would turn in a first draft, and then we would go through it carefully to try to make sure that it was correctly sourced and had a similar message to what we wanted to communicate, and make sure most of all that it resonated with advocates working on the front lines. So it was kind of a joint effort. And then the Real Story series was also an entire internship. So our interns have been doing amazing writing for the blog.
That's terrific.
Mm-hmm.
I was just curious about the teach-in you did with the college. Is that a university? I'm sorry I missed who you did that recent teach-in with about Brescia Meadows.
Yeah, that was with Virginia Commonwealth University.
Okay.
That's located about a block from our office. And it was our first kind of experiment doing something with them to invite the community into our new office. So it was a small turnout, but I think it's something that we can build on to try to build new relationships.
And did you develop your own materials, or did you use some of the materials from those who are organizing on Brescia Meadows' behalf? Or is it a combination of both?
No, we used the Free Brescia curriculum that was written by the Free Brescia campaign. They had sent out a call for, they wanted groups across the country to conduct teach-ins the week before her trial was supposed to happen. So we did that as kind of part of a national movement.
And Dot, maybe you could post that if you would, please.
Mm-hmm.
Kate, another thing is, it sounds like you all have done a lot of focus groups, and so I'm wondering if you have any suggestions of do's and don'ts when setting up the focus groups, because it sounds like you have them both review materials and messaging, etc.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have done a lot of focus groups. I'm sure we have lots of tips. I mean, the first one that comes to mind is be clear in what kind of feedback you're looking for. So, for example, when we did the focus groups to test the Red Flag campaign posters, we actually did a series of focus groups. So we collected groups of our target audience, namely college students, and asked them just to react to the copy on the poster, like the words on the poster, to make sure they made sense in their world and it was language that they used. And then we put all the copy on a design. So then we had a rough draft of the model and the image and everything, and then ran it by another fresh series of college students to ask them, does this model look like somebody who might be on your college campus? Does it look like a student, not a faculty member? Are the clothes they're wearing, do they look like they fit in with your campus? Does it Does the location look okay? Like, does it look like a college campus that you might be on yourself? And to test, like, can you read the words? Just to test all of the elements of the design of the poster, whereas the first series was around testing the content of the poster. So to be clear about the goal of your focus group is probably the number one thing in terms of running it.
It sounds like we, talking more about setting up good, effective focus groups could be another webinar, huh? Probably.
Yeah.
We're going to have to keep you on retainer there. I was just curious about who's part of the Racial Justice Task Force. Is that staff, or is that staff and staff from member programs or community people, et cetera?
It's staff and member programs. Community folks who are also our members are welcome to join, but realistically it's mostly advocates working in other programs.
That's really helpful. I have to say I love your wellness fairies, and I love the Justice Parade.
Yeah, right. I love the Justice Parade too. Call it a parade, and you'll get lots of support from the community. Don't call it a protest.
Those are really great tips. So I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
So right now in the chat box, the last message says "wonderful" with a lot of exclamation points after it. One of the best presentations I have attended. And I have to say, Kate, it was just very powerful, the work that you're doing, and how you talk about it is just so clear and so helpful. And the materials that you gave to us and that are available to everybody is just are really, really, really just incredibly useful. And I think I mentioned this to you, Kate, and for some of you who were on the webinar that the Idaho Coalition did, we also are interested in talking with some other programs about some of their internal policies, and we want to gather that information and may try to do another webinar to focus really on many of the things that Kate spent part of her webinar talking about, and also getting some input from some other coalitions. So we hope to do that in the future. So Kate, is there anything else you want to add? I mean, you said so much already, and I also want to thank you for keeping your voice up. You did a really good job. And Christy, I hope she spoke slowly enough.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No, you did a great job. You did a totally great job. So it's a lot to think about. And I also think that after people have an opportunity to look at some of the materials, they may have questions. And Kate's email is up there. You can contact her directly. You can also contact us. We'll be continuing to collect questions. And we can get them back to Kate. And like I said, we really do want to bring together some other people from coalitions to talk about their internal practices. So thank you so much.
Sure, you're welcome.
All right. So to be continued. As Kate noted, that we're students, many of us, and we're going to continue to keep thinking with others about ways we can do this work better. And Kate, I just think for me, one of the things that is so powerful about your message about just saying it's an essential part of our work and not an add-on, and just you came back to that so many times and gave us really good examples of that, and I really appreciate that.
Well, thanks for having me, Sue. I appreciate it.
All right. Thanks to everybody, and until next time. Thank you. Have a good afternoon. Thanks, Kate.